The year 1763 marked a turning point in the relationship between Great Britain and her American colonies, though few could have predicted the revolutionary storm that would follow. As church bells rang across London to celebrate the Treaty of Paris, officially ending the 7 Years' War, King George III and his ministers faced a sobering reality that would reshape the Atlantic world forever. Victory had come at an unprecedented cost, leaving the British Empire with a national debt that had doubled to over £130 million, a staggering sum that threatened the very foundations of imperial finance. The war had been fought on a global scale, with British forces engaging French armies and navies from the forests of North America to the sugar islands of the Caribbean, from the plains of Germany to the trading posts of India. The American theater alone had consumed vast resources, requiring the deployment of thousands of regular troops, the construction of fortifications stretching from Nova Scotia to Georgia, and the coordination of complex military campaigns across a continent larger than Europe itself. British generals like Edward Braddock had learned harsh lessons about wilderness warfare when his forces were decimated by French and Indian fighters near Fort Duquesne, while colonial militias had gained invaluable experience fighting alongside professional soldiers in campaigns that stretched from the frozen shores of Lake Champlain to the humid swamps of the Florida borderlands. The scale of British military commitment in North America had been extraordinary by any previous standard. At the height of the conflict, over 50,000 British and colonial troops were engaged in operations across the continent, supported by a naval force that included dozens of ships of the line and hundreds of smaller vessels. The logistics of maintaining such forces across 3,000 miles of ocean had strained British administrative capabilities to their limits, requiring innovations in supply, communication, and coordination that would influence military thinking for generations to come. Now, with French power broken in North America and Spain relegated to territories west of the Mississippi River, Britain found herself the undisputed master of the eastern half of the continent. Yet this triumph brought new challenges that would prove far more difficult to manage than any military campaign. The vast territories acquired through conquest required governance, defense, and development on a scale that dwarfed previous imperial commitments. Native American tribes, no longer able to play European powers against each other, posed new threats to frontier settlements while also representing potential allies whose loyalty had to be cultivated and maintained. Most pressing of all, the enormous debt accumulated during the war demanded immediate attention from a government already struggling to maintain its global commitments from Ireland to India. The transformation of North America's political landscape created unprecedented administrative challenges for British officials who had grown accustomed to managing a relatively simple imperial structure. The acquisition of Quebec brought over 60,000 French Catholics under British rule, requiring careful consideration of religious and legal traditions that differed fundamentally from English practices. The vast territories of the Great Lakes region and the Illinois country contained scattered French settlements, Native American villages, and British trading posts that needed to be integrated into a coherent system of governance. The Spanish territories east of the Mississippi, including the crucial port of New Orleans, had been transferred to British control, creating new responsibilities for managing international trade and frontier security. Lord Bute, the King's chief minister, understood that the American colonies would have to contribute more substantially to their own defense and administration. This seemed only logical, as the colonists had been the primary beneficiaries of British military protection and would continue to enjoy the security provided by regular troops stationed along the frontier. The average British taxpayer already bore a burden of 25 shillings per year in taxes, while their American counterparts paid barely 1 shilling. Such disparities could not continue indefinitely, especially when British merchants and manufacturers faced new competition from increasingly sophisticated colonial enterprises that had developed during the wartime disruption of normal trade patterns. The financial calculations that drove British policy were stark and undeniable. The annual cost of maintaining 10,000 troops in North America was estimated at over £300,000, while the entire revenue generated by colonial trade amounted to less than £2 million annually. The interest payments on the national debt alone consumed over £4 million each year, requiring tax rates that were already straining the patience of British taxpayers. Parliamentary leaders faced the unpalatable choice between raising taxes on an already overburdened domestic population or finding new sources of revenue within the empire itself. The first attempt to address these financial realities came through the Proclamation of 1763, issued on October 7th. This royal decree established a boundary line along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, prohibiting colonial settlement west of this natural barrier. The proclamation aimed to reduce conflicts with Native American tribes, minimize the costs of frontier defense, and concentrate colonial population in areas where British authority could be more effectively exercised. To colonial land speculators and ordinary settlers alike, however, this policy represented an unconscionable restriction on their natural right to expand westward into territories won through their own blood and sacrificed during years of frontier warfare. The proclamation reflected British officials' growing awareness that the costs of empire were spiraling beyond manageable limits. Each new settlement west of the mountains required military protection, administrative oversight, and diplomatic engagement with Native American tribes whose territorial claims often conflicted with colonial expansion. The experience of Pontiac's uprising, which erupted just months after the Treaty of Paris, had demonstrated the explosive potential of frontier conflicts and the enormous costs of suppressing Native American resistance to British authority. George Washington, already emerging as one of Virginia's most prominent planters, viewed the proclamation with particular dismay. His investments in western lands through the Ohio Company represented not merely potential profits, but a vision of American expansion that transcended narrow imperial calculations. In letters to fellow Virginians, Washington expressed frustration that British officials who had never set foot in the American wilderness presumed to dictate the limits of colonial enterprise. He argued that veterans of the recent war had earned the right to settle western lands through their military service, and that British restrictions on expansion violated the implicit contract between the Crown and its American subjects. Similar sentiments echoed throughout the colonies, where merchants, farmers, and artisans had long assumed that victory over France would open unlimited opportunities for westward expansion. The Connecticut Land Company had made extensive plans for settlements in the Wyoming Valley of Pennsylvania, while Virginia planters had organized syndicates to develop lands in the Ohio River Valley. Massachusetts investors had purchased claims to territories in what would become Vermont and New Hampshire, expecting that British victory would validate their speculative ventures. The proclamation line suddenly rendered all these investments worthless while blocking the natural outlet for colonial population growth that had driven American expansion for over a century. The proclamation also created administrative complications that revealed deeper tensions within the imperial system. Colonial governors found themselves caught between British directives that prohibited Western settlement and local pressures from constituents who viewed such restrictions as violations of their fundamental rights. Royal officials like Virginia Governor Francis Fauquier faced the impossible task of enforcing policies that lacked popular support while maintaining the cooperation of colonial assemblies, whose members had extensive investments in Western lands. The result was a pattern of official compliance with imperial directives, combined with unofficial tolerance of violations that undermined respect for British authority throughout the frontier regions. Native American leaders struggled to understand why their new British allies seemed less reliable than their former French partners. The French had maintained their influence through trade relationships and diplomatic alliances that respected tribal sovereignty while providing mutual benefits. British officials, by contrast, seemed primarily interested in establishing clear boundaries and administrative control that left little room for the complex negotiations and cultural accommodations that had characterized French-Indian relations. Chiefs like Pontiac of the Ottawa and Red Jacket of the Seneca found themselves dealing with British commanders who viewed Native Americans as obstacles to colonial development rather than as potential partners in continental expansion. The Pontiac Uprising of 1763, which saw coordinated attacks on British posts throughout the Great Lakes region, demonstrated the fragility of the new imperial arrangement and the ongoing costs of maintaining order on the frontier. The uprising began in May when Pontiac's forces attacked Fort Detroit, quickly spreading to encompass attacks on British installations from Fort Pitt to Fort Michilimackinac. Within months, 8 of the 14 British posts in the Great Lakes region had fallen to Native American forces, while frontier settlements throughout Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia came under sustained attack. The British response to Pontiac's uprising revealed both the strengths and limitations of imperial military power in North America. Regular troops under the command of Colonel Henry Bouquet eventually relieved Fort Pitt and restored British control over key strategic positions, but the costs were enormous and the underlying causes of Native American resistance remained unresolved. The campaign required the deployment of thousands of troops at a time when British officials were desperately seeking to reduce military expenditures in North America. More troubling still, the uprising demonstrated that British authority beyond the coastal settlements remained tenuous and dependent on the continued cooperation of Native American allies whose loyalty could not be taken for granted. Meanwhile, in London, Chancellor of the Exchequer George Grenville was developing more comprehensive plans for colonial taxation. A methodical administrator with extensive experience in financial matters, Grenville approached the American problem with the same systematic approach that had served him well in managing domestic revenues. He commissioned detailed studies of colonial trade patterns, consulted with customs officials who had served in American ports, and reviewed existing legislation governing imperial commerce. What he discovered convinced him that significant reforms were both necessary and overdue, but also that the potential for increased colonial revenue was far greater than previous administrations had realized. Grenville's investigation revealed a complex web of legal loopholes, administrative inefficiencies, and outright corruption that had allowed colonial merchants to evade imperial trade regulations for decades. The Navigation Acts, first enacted in the 1650s and repeatedly modified over the following century, had established the theoretical framework for regulating colonial trade, but their enforcement had been sporadic and often counterproductive. Colonial merchants had developed sophisticated networks for evading customs duties, while British officials had frequently turned a blind eye to violations in exchange for personal considerations or simply because they lacked the resources to monitor thousands of miles of coastline and hundreds of ports and harbors. The Navigation Acts required that certain enumerated goods, including tobacco, rice, and naval stores, be shipped only to Britain or other British colonies. They mandated that European goods destined for America pass through British ports, where they could be taxed and monitored. Most importantly, they restricted colonial manufacturing in areas where it might compete with British industry, ensuring that America remained primarily a source of raw materials and a market for finished goods. These regulations had been designed to maximize the economic benefits of empire for British merchants and manufacturers while preventing the development of colonial industries that might threaten metropolitan prosperity. In practice, however, enforcement of these regulations had been sporadic and often ineffective. The policy of salutary neglect, pursued by Prime Minister Robert Walpole and his successors for over 3 decades, had allowed colonial trade to flourish with minimal interference from imperial authorities. This arrangement had benefited both sides during peacetime, generating substantial profits for British merchants while allowing colonial economies to develop in ways that might not have been possible under strict enforcement of imperial trade laws. Colonial merchants had grown wealthy through trade with the French and Spanish West Indies, while British manufacturers had found expanding markets for their products in increasingly prosperous American communities. The outbreak of the 7 Years' War had disrupted these comfortable arrangements, as military necessity required closer attention to colonial trade patterns and greater coordination between imperial and colonial authorities. British naval commanders needed accurate information about colonial shipping to distinguish between legitimate commerce and enemy vessels, while military procurement officers required reliable supplies of colonial products to support British forces throughout North America. The war had also created new opportunities for colonial merchants to profit from military contracts and wartime trade, generating unprecedented levels of prosperity in cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. Grenville's investigation revealed that the American Customs Service collected barely £2,000 annually while costing over £7,000 to maintain. Such inefficiency was intolerable in an era when every source of revenue had to be maximized to service the enormous debt accumulated during the recent war. He ordered a complete overhaul of the customs system, appointing new collectors with strict instructions to enforce existing regulations and eliminate the corruption that had characterized previous administrations. Vice Admiralty courts, which operated without juries and applied British rather than colonial law, received expanded jurisdiction over smuggling cases, while naval vessels were assigned to patrol American waters and assist customs officials in their enforcement efforts. The Sugar Act of 1764, formerly known as the American Revenue Act, represented Grenville's first systematic attempt to extract meaningful revenue from colonial trade. This legislation actually reduced the duty on foreign molasses from 6 pence to 3 pence per gallon, recognizing that the previous rate had been so high as to encourage widespread evasion. However, the new law made clear that the reduced duty would be rigorously collected, with severe penalties for violations and enhanced powers for customs officials. The act also imposed new taxes on wine, coffee, textiles, and other imported goods while restricting colonial trade with non-British territories in the Caribbean. The economic logic behind the Sugar Act was compelling from the British perspective. The molasses trade with the French and Spanish West Indies had generated enormous profits for New England merchants, while providing minimal revenue to the imperial treasury. By reducing the duty to a level that made compliance more attractive than evasion, while simultaneously strengthening enforcement mechanisms, Grenville hoped to transform a largely theoretical tax into a reliable source of imperial revenue. The additional duties on luxury goods would fall primarily on wealthy colonists who could afford to pay higher prices, while the restrictions on foreign trade would force colonial merchants to conduct more of their business within the British Empire. More significantly, the Sugar Act established the principle that Parliament could tax the colonies for the purpose of raising revenue, not merely regulating trade. Previous imperial legislation had focused primarily on directing the flow of commerce within the empire, with any revenues generated being largely incidental to the regulatory purpose. Grenville's act explicitly stated that its objective was to defray the expenses of defending and protecting the American colonies, making clear that this was taxation in the most direct sense. This represented a fundamental shift in imperial policy that would have profound implications for the relationship between Britain and America. Colonial reaction to the Sugar Act revealed the depth of American resistance to imperial taxation and the sophistication of colonial constitutional arguments. In Boston, Samuel Adams began organizing merchants and artisans into committees of correspondence that would coordinate opposition activities throughout New England. Adams, a failed businessman who had discovered his true calling in political agitation, possessed an intuitive understanding of popular grievances and an exceptional talent for translating complex constitutional arguments into language that ordinary colonists could understand and embrace. His background as a tax collector had given him intimate knowledge of colonial economic conditions and the ways in which imperial policies affected different segments of American society. Adams understood that effective resistance required building coalitions that crossed traditional social and economic boundaries. He worked to unite wealthy merchants who were concerned about the impact of new taxes on their businesses with artisans and laborers who feared that imperial policies would undermine their economic opportunities. His ability to frame constitutional arguments in terms of practical economic concerns made abstract questions about representation and consent relevant to colonists who might otherwise have remained indifferent to political developments. The Massachusetts Assembly, led by James Otis Jr., passed resolutions challenging Parliament's right to tax the colonies without their consent. Otis, a brilliant lawyer whose father had been denied a judicial appointment by the royal governor, argued that taxation without representation violated the fundamental principles of English liberty. His pamphlet, The Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Proved, became one of the first systematic presentations of the colonial position. combining legal precedent with natural rights philosophy to construct a powerful case against imperial taxation. Otis's arguments drew heavily on the writings of English legal theorists like Sir Edward Coke and constitutional historians like Paul de Rapin-Toiras, demonstrating that colonial resistance was grounded in established English legal traditions rather than radical innovations. He argued that the principle of consent to taxation was fundamental to the English Constitution, and that Parliament's attempt to tax unrepresented colonists violated the same principles that had justified the English Revolution of 1688. This approach gave colonial arguments intellectual respectability while appealing to British opinion that remained committed to constitutional government and the rule of law. Similar protests emerged throughout the colonies as merchants calculated the impact of stricter enforcement on their businesses. In New York, traders who had built fortunes on the molasses trade with French and Spanish islands found their profit margins severely compressed by the combination of reduced duties and rigorous enforcement. The traditional practice of bribing customs officials or simply evading inspection altogether was no longer viable, forcing merchants to choose between paying the full legal duties or abandoning profitable trade relationships that had sustained their businesses for decades. Philadelphia merchants, who had developed extensive networks for importing European goods through Dutch and Danish ports, faced new restrictions that threatened established commercial relationships. The Sugar Act's provisions requiring that European goods pass through British ports before being shipped to America would significantly increase costs while subjecting colonial importers to additional layers of British regulation and taxation. Merchants who had grown wealthy through direct trade with continental European suppliers found themselves forced to restructure their entire business operations to comply with imperial requirements. Charleston rice planters, already struggling with market fluctuations caused by increased competition from other rice-producing regions, worried that additional taxes would make their crops less competitive in European markets. The enumeration of rice as a product that could only be shipped to Britain or other British colonies had already limited planters' marketing options, while the new duties on imported goods would increase the costs of the manufactured products that planters needed to maintain their operations. The combination of restricted markets and increased costs threatened the profitability of rice cultivation and the economic foundation of South Carolina society. The economic arguments against the Sugar Act were reinforced by constitutional objections that would prove even more significant in the long run. Colonial lawyers and political leaders began developing sophisticated theories about the nature of representation and the limits of parliamentary authority. They distinguished between external taxes, which regulated trade and could be justified as part of Parliament's authority over imperial commerce, and internal taxes, which directly extracted revenue from colonial subjects who had no voice in British political institutions. This distinction reflected deeper questions about the relationship between Britain and America within the imperial system. Were the colonies subordinate territories whose inhabitants enjoyed only those rights that Parliament chose to grant them? Or were they constituent parts of a greater British nation whose citizens possessed the same fundamental liberties as their counterparts in England, Scotland, and Wales? The answers to these questions would determine whether the empire could evolve into a more integrated political union or would fragment under the pressure of competing claims to authority. Colonial constitutional theorists like Daniel Dulany of Maryland and Stephen Hopkins of Rhode Island began developing sophisticated arguments about the nature of representation that went beyond simple assertions of colonial rights. Dulany's considerations on the propriety of imposing taxes in the British colonies argued that virtual representation, the British theory that members of Parliament represented the interests of all British subjects, regardless of whether they had voted for them, was inadequate to protect colonial interests. He contended that the economic and geographic differences between Britain and America made it impossible for British legislators to understand colonial conditions or to represent colonial interests effectively. Hopkins, in his pamphlet, The Rights of Colonies Examined, took the argument even further by questioning whether Parliament had any authority to tax the colonies under the British Constitution. He argued that the colonial charters had established the American assemblies as the legitimate representatives of colonial populations, and that Parliament's attempt to tax the colonies violated the terms under which British settlement in America had been undertaken. This position challenged not merely particular taxes, but the entire structure of imperial authority as it had developed over the previous century. The enforcement of the Sugar Act also created practical problems that complicated relations between British officials and colonial communities. Customs collectors, many of whom had purchased their positions and expected to profit from fees and seizures, found themselves caught between imperial directives and local hostility. The new emphasis on rigorous enforcement meant that collectors could no longer supplement their modest salaries through the traditional practice of accepting bribes in exchange for overlooking minor violations. Instead, they were expected to seize vessels and cargoes suspected of customs violations, a practice that generated substantial local resentment while providing uncertain financial rewards. Vice Admiralty judges, appointed by the Crown and dependent on London for their salaries, faced pressure to convict accused smugglers even when evidence was questionable. The expansion of Vice Admiralty jurisdiction meant that colonial merchants accused of customs violations could no longer count on sympathetic local juries to protect them from imperial prosecution. Instead, they faced judges who had clear incentives to support imperial policies and who operated according to legal procedures that differed significantly from those used in colonial common law courts. Naval officers, assigned to patrol American waters and assist customs officials, discovered that their presence was often resented by colonists who had previously viewed the Royal Navy as a protector rather than an enforcer. The use of naval vessels to intercept suspected smugglers transformed the Navy from a shield against foreign enemies into an instrument of imperial control that threatened colonial economic interests. This change in the Navy's role had profound implications for colonial attitudes toward British authority and for the relationship between military and civilian authorities in American communities. These tensions were particularly evident in Rhode Island, where the economy depended heavily on trade with the French West Indies. Newport merchants had built substantial fortunes by exchanging lumber, livestock, and agricultural products for molasses, which they then distilled into rum for export to Africa and Europe. The triangular trade that connected New England, the Caribbean, and West Africa had become so central to Rhode Island's prosperity that any interference with this commerce threatened the colony's economic survival. The molasses trade was particularly important to Rhode Island because the colony lacked the agricultural resources that sustained other New England communities. Unlike Massachusetts or Connecticut, which could rely on farming, fishing, and small-scale manufacturing to support their populations, Rhode Island had become almost entirely dependent on commerce for its prosperity. The colony's merchants had developed expertise in navigating the complex regulations and diplomatic relationships that governed Caribbean trade, building networks of correspondents and agents throughout the West Indies who facilitated their commercial operations. When the revenue cutter St. John began seizing vessels suspected of customs violations, local residents responded with organized resistance that demonstrated the depth of popular opposition to imperial policies. In July 1764, a group of men boarded the cutter while it was anchored in Newport Harbor, damaged its rigging, and threatened its crew. The attackers, who included both wealthy merchants and ordinary sailors, made clear that they would not tolerate interference with what they viewed as legitimate commercial activities that had sustained their community for generations. Similar incidents occurred throughout New England as colonists demonstrated their determination to resist what they viewed as arbitrary interference with legitimate commercial activities. In Connecticut, customs officials found their efforts to inspect vessels hampered by crowds of local residents who surrounded suspected smugglers and prevented seizures. Massachusetts merchants organized boycotts of British goods while simultaneously increasing their trade with non-British territories in violation of imperial regulations. The result was an escalating cycle of resistance and enforcement that poisoned relations between British officials and colonial communities throughout the region. The British response to such resistance revealed the limitations of imperial authority in America. Military forces were insufficient to patrol thousands of miles of coastline, while local magistrates were often reluctant to prosecute their neighbors for violations of unpopular laws. Royal governors, dependent on colonial assemblies for their salaries and lacking independent sources of revenue, found themselves unable to enforce imperial policies that lacked popular support. The result was a cycle of defiance and retaliation that would characterize British-American relations for the remainder of the colonial period. General Thomas Gage, who commanded British forces in North America, reported to his superiors that the enforcement of imperial trade regulations was generating dangerous levels of popular resentment throughout the colonies. His correspondence with the War Office revealed growing concern that British policies were undermining the loyalty of colonial populations who had supported Britain enthusiastically during the recent war against France. Gage warned that continued enforcement of unpopular policies might require the deployment of additional troops at a time when the government was desperately seeking to reduce military expenditures in America. As 1764 drew to a close, both sides began preparing for a more comprehensive confrontation over the fundamental questions raised by the Sugar Act. In London, Grenville was already developing plans for additional revenue measures that would test colonial resistance even more severely. His correspondence with colonial governors and customs officials convinced him that American opposition was based primarily on economic self-interest rather than principled constitutional objections. He believed that firm enforcement of existing laws, combined with new taxes that could not be easily evaded, would eventually overcome colonial resistance and establish the precedent of parliamentary taxation that was essential to the empire's financial stability. Grenville's confidence was reinforced by reports from colonial officials who assured him that resistance to the Sugar Act was limited to a small minority of merchants whose illegal activities had been disrupted by stricter enforcement. Governor Francis Bernard of Massachusetts reported that most colonists accepted the necessity of contributing to imperial defense, and that organized opposition came primarily from smugglers and other lawbreakers who had profited from the previous lack of enforcement. Similar assessments came from other royal governors who either misunderstood the depth of colonial opposition or chose to tell their superiors what they wanted to hear. In America, colonial leaders were reaching different conclusions about British intentions and the appropriate response to imperial policies. The Sugar Act had demonstrated that the era of salutary neglect was ending, and that Parliament was prepared to assert its authority over colonial affairs in unprecedented ways. The question was whether American resistance should focus on securing exemptions from particular taxes or should challenge the broader principle of parliamentary taxation without colonial consent. The debate over strategy revealed important divisions within colonial society that would persist throughout the Revolutionary period. Conservative leaders like Thomas Hutchinson of Massachusetts and Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania argued that colonial interests would be best served by working within the existing imperial system to secure modifications to objectionable policies. They maintained that direct confrontation with British authority would provoke retaliation that would damage colonial economic interests while failing to achieve meaningful reforms. Radical leaders like Samuel Adams and James Otis, by contrast, argued that the Sugar Act represented the beginning of a systematic campaign to reduce the colonies to a state of dependence that would ultimately destroy American liberty. They maintained that any acceptance of parliamentary taxation without colonial consent would establish a precedent that could be used to justify unlimited future impositions. This position required colonial leaders to articulate sophisticated constitutional arguments about the nature of representation and consent that went far beyond the simple economic objections that had characterized earlier protests against imperial policies. The Stamp Act crisis that would dominate 1765 was already taking shape in the minds of both British ministers and American colonists. Grenville's decision to impose direct taxes on legal documents, newspapers, and other paper goods would force both sides to confront the fundamental questions about representation, consent, and the nature of the imperial relationship that the Sugar Act had raised but not resolved. The stage was set for a confrontation that would transform a dispute over trade regulations into a constitutional crisis that would ultimately lead to the dissolution of the First British Empire. The winter of 1764 to 1765 witnessed intensive preparation on both sides of the Atlantic as the implications of the new imperial policy became clear. In London, Grenville worked closely with Treasury officials to design a tax system that would be difficult to evade and would generate substantial revenue from colonial sources. The stamp tax had proven effective in England and other parts of the empire, providing a steady stream of income while requiring minimal administrative apparatus. By requiring that legal documents, commercial papers, newspapers, and even playing cards bear special stamps purchased from government agents, the tax would touch virtually every aspect of colonial economic and social life. The administrative advantages of the stamp tax were considerable from the British perspective. Unlike customs duties, which required extensive enforcement apparatus and were vulnerable to smuggling and evasion, the stamp tax would be largely self-enforcing. Documents that lacked the required stamps would be invalid in colonial courts, creating powerful incentives for compliance even without extensive monitoring by imperial officials. Lawyers could not file legal papers, merchants could not complete commercial transactions, and newspaper publishers could not distribute their publications without purchasing the appropriate stamps. The beauty of the stamp tax, from Grenville's perspective, lay in its comprehensive coverage and its integration into the normal functioning of colonial society. Unlike the Sugar Act, which primarily affected merchants engaged in particular types of trade, the stamp tax would require virtually every colonist to contribute to imperial revenues in the course of their normal activities. Land transactions, court proceedings, commercial contracts, and even entertainment would all be subject to the new tax, making it impossible for any significant segment of colonial society to avoid contributing to the costs of imperial defense. Grenville also believed that the stamp tax would be more acceptable to colonial opinion than the Sugar Act because it applied equally to all residents rather than targeting particular trades or regions. Unlike the molasses duty, which primarily affected New England merchants, or the wine tax, which mainly impacted wealthy consumers, the stamp tax would distribute the burden of imperial taxation across the entire colonial population. This seemed both more equitable and more likely to minimize organized resistance by preventing any single group from bearing a disproportionate share of the costs. The Chancellor's confidence in colonial acceptance was reinforced by consultations with American agents in London, including Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania and Jared Ingersoll of Connecticut. These colonial representatives, while expressing reservations about the timing and extent of new taxes, did not predict the massive resistance that would actually materialize. Franklin, in particular, seemed to believe that the colonists would ultimately accept parliamentary taxation if it were imposed gradually and coupled with other imperial reforms that addressed colonial grievances about trade restrictions and administrative inefficiencies. Franklin's assessment reflected his sophisticated understanding of imperial politics and his belief that the relationship between Britain and America could be reformed through negotiation and compromise. As one of the most prominent Americans in London, Franklin had extensive contacts with British politicians and merchants who shared his interest in maintaining imperial unity while addressing the financial pressures created by the recent war. His correspondence with colonial leaders revealed his conviction that resistance to British policies should focus on securing better terms rather than challenging fundamental principles of imperial authority. This miscalculation reflected the distance that separated even the most knowledgeable British officials from the realities of American political culture. The agents who represented colonial interests in London were typically wealthy, well-educated men who moved comfortably in British society and shared many assumptions with their metropolitan counterparts. They understood the financial pressures facing the imperial government and recognized the logic of requiring colonial contributions to imperial defense. What they failed to appreciate was the depth of popular opposition to any form of direct taxation by a legislature in which Americans had no representation. The colonial agents' misunderstanding of American opinion was compounded by their isolation from the political developments that were transforming colonial society. Men like Franklin and Ingersoll spent years in London, maintaining their connections to colonial politics primarily through correspondence with fellow members of the colonial elite. They had limited contact with the artisans, small merchants, and farmers who were becoming increasingly important actors in colonial political life and whose opposition to imperial policies would prove crucial to the success of resistance movements. Meanwhile, in the colonies, the lessons of the Sugar Act were being absorbed by political leaders who were developing increasingly sophisticated arguments against parliamentary taxation. The Virginia House of Burgesses, meeting in Williamsburg during the spring of 1765, engaged in lengthy debates about the constitutional foundations of British authority in America. Richard Henry Lee, Patrick Henry, and other young lawyers challenged the older generation of colonial leaders who had traditionally deferred to imperial authority on matters of taxation and trade regulation. These debates revealed generational and ideological divisions within colonial society that would prove crucial to the development of revolutionary sentiment. Older leaders like Peyton Randolph and Edmund Pendleton, who had built their careers within the existing imperial system, were reluctant to challenge parliamentary authority directly. They had profited from their connections to British merchants and officials and feared that confrontational policies might jeopardize the economic and political advantages that Virginia had enjoyed within the empire. The older generation of Virginia leaders had grown up during the era of salutary neglect, when imperial policies had generally supported colonial interests, and when cooperation with British authorities had brought tangible benefits to colonial communities. They remembered the prosperity that had accompanied Virginia's integration into the Atlantic tobacco trade and the security that British military power had provided during conflicts with France and Spain. Their reluctance to challenge imperial authority reflected not merely personal interest, but a genuine belief that Virginia's future lay in maintaining close ties with Britain, while seeking reforms through established channels. Younger men like Patrick Henry, who had achieved prominence as a lawyer representing ordinary planters against established interests, were more willing to question fundamental assumptions about the imperial relationship. Henry's famous speech in the Parsons Cause case, where he had argued that King George III had forfeited the allegiance of his Virginia subjects by disallowing colonial legislation, demonstrated a willingness to challenge imperial authority that shocked conservative members of the colonial elite. Henry's background differed significantly from that of the established Virginia gentry, and his political appeal rested on his ability to articulate the grievances of small planters and frontier settlers who felt excluded from the benefits of the imperial system. His legal practice had brought him into contact with colonists who struggled to pay their debts, who faced foreclosure on their properties, and who resented the privileges enjoyed by wealthy planters with connections to British merchants and officials. This experience had given him an understanding of popular grievances that the established leadership lacked. The emergence of popular leaders like Henry reflected broader changes in colonial society that made resistance to British policies more likely and more effective than imperial officials realized. The growth of colonial cities had created concentrations of artisans, laborers, and small merchants who were directly affected by imperial trade regulations, but had little stake in maintaining harmonious relations with British authorities. These urban populations provided a ready constituency for leaders who could articulate their grievances in terms of broader principles about liberty and self-government. The expansion of colonial printing had also created new mechanisms for coordinating resistance across vast distances. Newspapers like the Boston Gazette, the New York Journal, and the Virginia Gazette provided forums for debating imperial policies and sharing information about resistance activities in different colonies. The number of newspapers published in the American colonies had increased dramatically during the 1750s and early 1760s, reflecting growing literacy rates and increased interest in political affairs among ordinary colonists. Pamphlets and broadsides could be produced quickly and distributed widely, allowing colonial writers to respond rapidly to British policies and to build networks of correspondence that transcended traditional boundaries between colonies. The technology of printing had become sufficiently advanced and inexpensive that even small communities could support local newspapers, while the postal system established during the recent war provided reliable means of communication between distant colonial centers. When news of the proposed Stamp Act reached America in early 1765, these networks were already in place and ready to coordinate a response that would surprise British officials with its scope and intensity. The Virginia Resolves, passed by the House of Burgesses in May 1765, established the constitutional framework for colonial resistance by asserting that only colonial assemblies had the right to tax their constituents. Patrick Henry's fiery speeches in support of these resolves, including his alleged threat that King George might suffer the same fate as Julius Caesar, electrified colonial opinion and provided a rallying point for opponents of British policy. The Virginia Resolves were carefully crafted to appeal to different segments of colonial opinion while maintaining a facade of loyalty to the crown. They acknowledged that Virginia's inhabitants owed allegiance to the king and were bound by parliamentary legislation on matters of general imperial concern. However, they insisted that taxation was a matter of internal governance that fell within the exclusive jurisdiction of colonial assemblies. This distinction between external and internal matters would become central to colonial constitutional theory and would provide the intellectual foundation for organized resistance to British policies. The language of the resolves reflected the influence of English legal traditions and constitutional theory, demonstrating that colonial arguments were grounded in established precedent rather than radical innovation. The Virginia legislators drew heavily on the writings of Sir Edward Coke, John Locke, and other English theorists who had articulated principles of limited government and the rule of law. By framing their arguments in terms of English constitutional traditions, colonial leaders hoped to appeal to British opinion while establishing the legitimacy of their resistance to parliamentary taxation. The spread of the Virginia Resolves throughout the colonies demonstrated the effectiveness of the new networks of communication that connected American political communities. Within weeks, similar resolutions were being debated in assemblies from Massachusetts to South Carolina, with local variations that reflected regional concerns while maintaining the essential argument about taxation and representation. The speed with which the resolves circulated and the consistency of colonial responses revealed a level of intercolonial coordination that had not existed during previous confrontations with British authority. The Pennsylvania Assembly, dominated by Quakers who preferred accommodation to confrontation, initially rejected similar resolves but faced mounting pressure from Philadelphia artisans and merchants who supported more aggressive resistance. The Quaker leadership, which had traditionally maintained cordial relations with British authorities and had benefited from imperial protection during conflicts with neighboring colonies, was reluctant to endorse positions that might jeopardize Pennsylvania's special relationship with the Crown. However, the growing influence of non-Quaker populations in Pennsylvania, combined with pressure from merchants whose businesses would be directly affected by the Stamp Act, eventually forced the Assembly to adopt a more confrontational stance. The Presbyterian and German populations that had settled in Pennsylvania during the previous decades had fewer ties to British authorities and were more willing to support resistance to imperial policies that threatened their economic interests. The summer of 1765 witnessed the emergence of organized popular resistance that went far beyond the genteel protests of colonial assemblies. The Sons of Liberty, a loosely coordinated network of resistance organizations, began forming in major colonial cities to coordinate opposition to the Stamp Act. These groups drew their membership from diverse segments of colonial society, including prosperous merchants who were concerned about the economic impact of new taxes, skilled artisans who resented British restrictions on colonial manufacturing, and laborers who were attracted by the democratic rhetoric of the resistance movement. The Sons of Liberty represented a new form of political organization that transcended traditional social and regional boundaries within colonial society. Unlike the established political institutions that were dominated by wealthy elites, the Sons of Liberty welcomed participation from ordinary colonists who had previously been excluded from political decision-making. This democratic character made the organization particularly effective in mobilizing popular resistance while also making it threatening to conservative colonial leaders who feared that challenges to British authority might lead to broader social upheaval. In Boston, Samuel Adams emerged as the master organizer of popular resistance, building coalitions that bridged class and regional divisions within Massachusetts society. Adams understood that effective resistance required the participation of ordinary colonists who had the numbers and the economic leverage to make British policies unenforceable. He worked closely with artisans like Paul Revere and merchants like John Hancock to create organizations that could sustain prolonged resistance while maintaining discipline and avoiding the kind of random violence that might alienate moderate opinion. Adams's organizing genius lay in his ability to connect abstract constitutional arguments with concrete economic grievances that affected ordinary colonists in their daily lives. He demonstrated how the Stamp Act would increase the costs of legal proceedings, making it more difficult for ordinary colonists to defend their property rights or pursue commercial opportunities. He showed how the tax on newspapers would limit access to information that was essential to informed political participation. Most importantly, he argued that acceptance of parliamentary taxation would establish a precedent that could be used to justify unlimited future impositions on colonial economic activity. The effectiveness of Adams's organizing became evident on August 14, 1765, when a Boston crowd destroyed the home and offices of Andrew Oliver, the designated stamp distributor for Massachusetts. The crowd, estimated at several thousand people, included representatives from all levels of Boston society, from wealthy merchants to common laborers. They hanged Oliver in effigy, demolished his stamp office, and forced him to resign his position before the stamps had even arrived from England. The attack on Oliver's property was carefully orchestrated to achieve maximum political impact while avoiding the kind of random violence that might discredit the resistance movement. The crowd focused their attention on symbols of British authority while avoiding personal violence against Oliver himself. They destroyed official documents and stamp-related materials while leaving Oliver's personal possessions largely untouched. This disciplined approach demonstrated that popular resistance could be both effective and controlled, challenging British authority while maintaining respect for property rights and personal safety. Similar demonstrations occurred throughout the colonies as local Sons of Liberty organizations targeted stamp distributors and other officials associated with the new tax. In New York, crowds forced the resignation of James McEvers, while in Philadelphia, John Hughes faced such intense pressure that he agreed to suspend his activities until the constitutional questions surrounding the Stamp Act could be resolved. The coordination of these activities across colonial boundaries revealed a level of intercolonial cooperation that had not been achieved during previous resistance movements. By the time the law was scheduled to take effect on November 1, 1765, not a single stamp distributor remained in office in any of the mainland colonies. This represented a stunning victory for colonial resistance, demonstrating that coordinated popular action could make British policies unenforceable even before they were formally implemented. The success of the campaign against the stamp distributors also established important precedents for future resistance activities and created networks of communication and organization that would prove crucial in subsequent confrontations with British authority. The resignation of the stamp distributors represented a crucial victory for colonial resistance, but it also created new challenges for both sides. British officials found themselves unable to implement a law that Parliament had passed and the King had signed, while colonial leaders had to maintain popular mobilization without allowing it to degenerate into general lawlessness. The stakes were rising as both sides committed themselves to positions that would be difficult to abandon without significant loss of face. The colonial non-importation movement that emerged in response to the Stamp Act demonstrated the economic leverage that Americans could exercise within the imperial system. Merchants in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston agreed to suspend orders for British goods until the Stamp Act was repealed, while consumers pledged to avoid purchasing imported items that were subject to British taxes. These agreements required unprecedented cooperation among competitors and represented a significant sacrifice for merchants whose businesses depended on British trade. The non-importation agreements were particularly significant because they demonstrated colonial ability to coordinate economic resistance across regional boundaries while maintaining the discipline necessary for sustained political action. The agreements required participating merchants to sacrifice immediate profits for long-term political objectives, while consumers had to accept reduced access to manufactured goods and luxury items that had become integral to colonial lifestyles. The success of these agreements revealed a level of political commitment and organizational sophistication that surprised both British officials and colonial conservatives. The effectiveness of non-importation became evident within months as British manufacturers and exporters began feeling the impact of reduced American orders. The textile industry, which had become increasingly dependent on colonial markets, faced particular hardships as American consumers shifted to domestic alternatives or simply reduced their consumption of manufactured goods. London merchants who had invested heavily in the American trade found their warehouses filled with unsold inventory, while their colonial correspondents defaulted on debts and canceled future orders. The impact of colonial resistance on British commerce was amplified by the timing of the non-importation movement, which coincided with economic difficulties in Britain that had resulted from the dislocations of the recent war. British manufacturers were already struggling with reduced demand for military supplies and the challenges of converting wartime production facilities to peacetime uses. The loss of American markets at such a critical time threatened the financial stability of businesses throughout Britain while creating unemployment in manufacturing centers that depended on export trade. These economic pressures created a powerful constituency for repeal within British commercial circles, but they also raised fundamental questions about the relationship between economic and political authority within the empire. If colonial resistance could force Parliament to retreat from policies that had been adopted after careful deliberation, what would become of British sovereignty over the American territories? The precedent of successful resistance to parliamentary taxation might encourage future challenges to other aspects of imperial authority, potentially leading to the complete breakdown of the system that had governed British-American relations for over a century. As 1765 drew to a close, both British ministers and colonial leaders were searching for ways to resolve the crisis without abandoning their fundamental positions. The Stamp Act Congress, which met in New York in October, provided a forum for colonial representatives to coordinate their constitutional arguments and present a united front to British authorities. The delegates, drawn from 9 colonies, carefully crafted petitions that acknowledged parliamentary authority over external affairs while insisting on colonial rights to internal self-taxation. The Congress represented a significant step toward intercolonial cooperation, but it also revealed the limitations of colonial unity in the face of British power. Southern colonies like Virginia and North Carolina refused to send delegates, while others imposed strict limitations on their representatives' authority to commit their governments to specific courses of action. The resulting petitions, while eloquent in their presentation of colonial grievances, lacked the force that would have come from truly unified colonial resistance. The deliberations of the Stamp Act Congress also revealed important divisions within colonial leadership about the appropriate strategy for resisting British policies. Conservative delegates like Robert Ogden of New Jersey and Timothy Ruggles of Massachusetts argued for moderate petitions that would appeal to British sense of justice while avoiding direct challenges to parliamentary authority. They feared that confrontational language might provoke retaliation that would damage colonial interests while failing to achieve meaningful reforms. More radical delegates like Christopher Gadsden of South Carolina and Caesar Rodney of Delaware insisted that colonial petitions should clearly articulate American constitutional principles and should not compromise on fundamental questions about representation and consent. They argued that moderate language would be interpreted as weakness and would encourage British officials to believe that colonial resistance could be overcome through minor concessions rather than fundamental reforms. Nevertheless, the combination of popular resistance, economic pressure, and constitutional argument was beginning to have its effect on British opinion. Members of Parliament who had supported the Stamp Act began to question whether the revenue it might generate would justify the costs of enforcement and the risks to imperial unity. The Rockingham administration, which had replaced Grenville's government in July 1765, was more sympathetic to colonial concerns and more willing to consider modifications to imperial policy that might restore harmony within the empire. The change in British government created new opportunities for colonial agents and their British allies to influence imperial policy through lobbying and negotiation. Benjamin Franklin, who had initially supported the Stamp Act as a preferable alternative to other forms of taxation, began working with British merchants and politicians who favored repeal. His testimony before Parliament in early 1766 would prove crucial in convincing British legislators that colonial resistance was based on principled constitutional objections rather than mere economic self-interest. The stage was thus set for the great parliamentary debates of 1766 that would result in the repeal of the Stamp Act, but also in the passage of the Declaratory Act, which asserted Parliament's right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. This combination of tactical retreat and constitutional assertion would establish the pattern that would characterize British-American relations for the remainder of the colonial period, with each side winning partial victories while the fundamental questions about representation, taxation, and sovereignty remained unresolved. The winter of 1770 brought a deceptive calm to the streets of Boston, but beneath the surface, tensions simmered like water approaching its boiling point. The partial repeal of the Townshend Acts had removed duties on glass, lead, paper, and paint, yet the tax on tea remained as a symbol of parliamentary authority that neither side could ignore. British officials hoped this compromise would restore order to the colonies, while radical leaders like Samuel Adams understood that the fundamental constitutional questions remained unresolved. The merchants who had organized boycotts found themselves caught between economic necessity and political principle, as trade slowly resumed, but the underlying grievances festered in coffee houses and taverns throughout the city. On the evening of March 5, 1770, these underlying tensions exploded into violence outside the Custom House on King Street. What began as a minor altercation between a British sentry and a young wigmaker's apprentice quickly escalated as crowds gathered in the cold night air. The apprentice had accused the sentry of striking him, and word spread rapidly through the narrow streets of Boston's waterfront district. By 8 o'clock, a crowd of several dozen colonists had assembled, their breath visible in the frigid air as they hurled insults and chunks of ice at the lone soldier. The sentry, Private Hugh White, stood his ground nervously, his musket loaded but his orders unclear about when he might use it against civilians. Captain Thomas Preston of the 29th Regiment received word of the disturbance and made the fateful decision to dispatch a relief guard to protect his beleaguered sentry. The 7 soldiers who marched through the streets that night carried loaded muskets with fixed bayonets, their red coats stark against the snow-covered cobblestones. As they formed a semicircle around the Custom House, the crowd swelled to nearly 400 people. Drawn by the commotion and the prospect of confronting the hated symbols of British authority, the soldiers found themselves pressed against the building, surrounded by an increasingly hostile mob that showed no signs of dispersing despite the late hour and bitter cold. The crowd pressed closer, shouting, "Fire and be damned," while pelting the soldiers with snowballs, oyster shells, and pieces of coal. Some colonists brandished clubs and sticks, while others threw chunks of ice hard enough to knock a man down. Crispus Attucks, a sailor of mixed African and Native American heritage, stood at the front of the crowd, his imposing figure silhouetted against the flickering light of nearby windows. Samuel Gray, a rope worker who had been involved in earlier altercations with British soldiers, pushed forward alongside other laborers and artisans who had grown increasingly frustrated with the military occupation of their city. The tension between soldiers and rope workers had been building for weeks, as off-duty soldiers often sought employment in the same trades that provided livelihoods for Boston's working men. In the confusion and chaos of that March evening, with colonists pressing forward and soldiers backing against the Custom House wall, someone shouted what sounded like an order to fire. The exact words remain disputed to this day, but in the darkness and din of the crowd, Private Hugh Montgomery, struck by a club and knocked to the ground, discharged his musket as he fell. The flash of gunpowder illuminated the scene for an instant, and the other soldiers, hearing the shot and believing they had received the command to fire, pulled their triggers in rapid succession. The musket balls tore through the crowd, and when the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead or dying in the blood-stained snow. Crispus Attucks died instantly, struck by 2 musket balls in the chest, his body falling heavily onto the cobblestones where his blood began to freeze in the March cold. Samuel Gray fell with a bullet through his head, while James Caldwell, a young sailor barely 20 years old, was shot in the back as he attempted to flee the scene. Samuel Maverick, only 17 years old and an apprentice to an ivory turner, lingered for several hours before succumbing to his wounds, his youth making his death particularly tragic to those who witnessed his final moments. Patrick Carr, an Irish immigrant and leather worker, died 9 days later after providing testimony that would complicate the legal proceedings that followed, his deathbed statements suggesting that the soldiers had acted in self-defense. The immediate aftermath of what colonists quickly dubbed the Boston Massacre revealed the deep divisions within colonial society about how to respond to British authority. Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson arrived at the scene within minutes of the shooting, climbing onto the balcony of the town house to address the angry crowd that threatened to storm the nearby British barracks. His promise that justice would be done and his order for the troops to return to their quarters prevented what might have become a full-scale riot, but the damage to British credibility was already severe. Hutchinson, a native-born Massachusetts man who had spent his life in colonial service, found himself caught between his loyalty to the crown and his understanding of colonial grievances. Samuel Adams and other radical leaders recognized immediately that the shooting provided them with powerful propaganda to advance their cause. Within days, Paul Revere had produced his famous engraving depicting the soldiers as cold-blooded murderers firing into a peaceful crowd, while Bostonians organized elaborate funeral processions for the victims that drew thousands of mourners through the city streets. The image of British soldiers killing unarmed colonists spread rapidly throughout America, carried by newspapers, pamphlets, and word of mouth to every corner of the continent. Adams understood that the emotional impact of the massacre could unite colonists who might disagree on constitutional questions, but could all sympathize with the victims of apparent military brutality. Yet the legal proceedings that followed the massacre revealed the complexity of colonial attitudes toward British rule and the rule of law itself. Captain Preston and his 8 soldiers were arrested and charged with murder, but finding lawyers willing to defend them proved difficult until John Adams and Josiah Quincy agreed to take the case. Adams, despite his opposition to British policies, believed firmly that even British soldiers deserved competent legal representation and a fair trial under colonial law. His decision to defend the soldiers was unpopular among many Bostonians and potentially damaging to his political career, but he viewed it as essential to maintaining the integrity of colonial justice. The trials, held in the fall of 1770, became a test of colonial commitment to legal principles versus popular passion. Adams argued skillfully that the soldiers had acted in self-defense, faced with a hostile mob that had threatened their lives and pelted them with dangerous projectiles. He portrayed the crowd as a motley rabble of saucy boys, Negroes and mulattoes, Irish Teagues and outlandish Jack Tars, language that reflected the class and racial prejudices of the time, while deflecting blame from the soldiers to the crowd. His strategy was to convince the jury that the soldiers were not murderers but frightened men who had responded reasonably to a threatening situation. Captain Preston was acquitted after a separate trial, and 6 of the 8 soldiers were found not guilty of murder. 2 soldiers, Hugh Montgomery and Matthew Kilroy, were convicted of the lesser charge of manslaughter and were branded on their thumbs before being released. The verdicts disappointed many colonists who had expected harsh punishment for the soldiers, but they also demonstrated that colonial juries could render impartial justice even in politically charged cases. The trials established important precedents for the protection of legal rights and the independence of colonial courts from popular pressure. The Boston Massacre trials had profound implications for the development of American legal and political culture. They established precedents for civilian control over military forces and reinforced the principle that even unpopular defendants deserved vigorous legal representation. John Adams would later write that his defense of the British soldiers was one of the most important services he ever rendered to his country, not because he sympathized with British policies, but because he helped establish that American justice would be based on law rather than mob rule. The trials also demonstrated the sophistication of colonial legal institutions and their capacity to handle complex criminal cases involving sensitive political issues. In the immediate aftermath of the massacre and trials, both British officials and colonial leaders sought to reduce tensions and prevent further violence. The British garrison was withdrawn from Boston to Castle Island in the harbor, removing the visible symbol of military occupation that had inflamed colonial resentments. The partial repeal of the Townshend Acts, combined with the removal of troops, created a period of relative calm that some observers hoped might lead to a permanent reconciliation between Britain and her American colonies. Trade resumed, and many merchants who had participated in boycotts were eager to restore profitable commercial relationships with British suppliers. However, this apparent calm masked the continuing growth of colonial resistance organizations and the development of new forms of political opposition to British rule. The Committees of Correspondence, first established in Boston in 1772, created a network of communication that linked towns throughout Massachusetts and eventually connected resistance movements across all 13 colonies. These committees served as shadow governments that could coordinate opposition to British policies and maintain revolutionary momentum, even during periods of apparent peace. They also provided a forum for political education, spreading pamphlets and newspapers that kept constitutional issues alive in public consciousness. Samuel Adams, often called the master of the town meeting, understood that sustained resistance required more than dramatic confrontations with British authority. He worked tirelessly to build broad-based coalitions that included merchants concerned about trade regulations, artisans worried about competition from British manufactured goods, and farmers resentful of quitrents and other feudal obligations. His genius lay in his ability to connect local grievances to broader constitutional principles and to maintain revolutionary fervor, even when British policies seemed relatively benign. Adams recognized that successful resistance movements required both ideological commitment and practical organization, and he devoted himself to building both. The network of correspondence committees proved its effectiveness when the British government announced its intention to pay the salaries of colonial judges directly from customs revenues rather than allowing colonial assemblies to control judicial compensation. This seemingly technical administrative change struck at the heart of colonial self-government, since assemblies had long used their power of the purse to influence judicial decisions and maintain some degree of independence from royal authority. The prospect of judges who owed their salaries entirely to the crown raised fears that colonial courts would become instruments of imperial policy rather than protectors of colonial rights. The response to the judges' salary controversy demonstrated how thoroughly the resistance movement had penetrated colonial society. Town meetings throughout Massachusetts passed resolutions condemning the policy, while committees of correspondence coordinated their responses to ensure a unified colonial position. The controversy also revealed how British attempts to strengthen imperial control often had the unintended consequence of strengthening colonial resistance by providing new grievances around which opposition forces could rally. Each new imperial initiative seemed to validate colonial fears about a systematic plan to reduce them to slavery, even when British officials had no such comprehensive design. By 1773, the temporary calm that had followed the Boston Massacre was beginning to fracture under the pressure of accumulated grievances and competing visions of imperial governance. The Tea Act, passed by Parliament in May 1773, would provide the spark that ignited these underlying tensions into open rebellion. The act was designed primarily to rescue the financially troubled East India Company by allowing it to sell tea directly to American consumers without paying duties in Britain, effectively giving the company a monopoly on the American tea trade. The East India Company, one of the most powerful commercial enterprises in the British Empire, had accumulated enormous debts from its operations in India and needed new sources of revenue to avoid bankruptcy. From the British perspective, the Tea Act was a reasonable measure that would actually reduce the price of tea for American consumers while generating revenue for the empire and saving an important British commercial enterprise. The tax on tea remained the same, but the elimination of middlemen and the remission of British duties would make tea cheaper in America than it had been for years. British officials could not understand why colonists would object to a measure that provided them with less expensive tea while maintaining the principle of parliamentary taxation. They viewed colonial opposition as unreasonable and motivated by the selfish interests of smugglers and merchants who profited from the existing system. Colonial opposition to the Tea Act, however, was based on both economic and constitutional grounds that British officials consistently underestimated. American merchants who had profited from the tea trade saw their livelihoods threatened by the East India Company's monopoly, while smugglers who had imported Dutch tea faced the prospect of being undersold by legal British tea. More fundamentally, colonial leaders recognized that the act was designed to trick Americans into accepting parliamentary taxation by making it economically attractive. They understood that if colonists accepted cheap tea with a tax attached, they would be acknowledging Parliament's right to tax them and opening the door to unlimited future taxation. The strategy behind colonial opposition to the Tea Act revealed the sophisticated political thinking that had developed during the previous decade of resistance to British policies. Rather than simply protesting the tax on tea, colonial leaders focused their opposition on the monopoly granted to the East India Company and the threat this precedent posed to American commercial freedom. They argued that if Parliament could grant exclusive trading privileges to one company, it could destroy any branch of American commerce that competed with British interests. This argument appealed to a broad range of colonists who might not have been concerned about constitutional questions, but who understood the economic implications of commercial monopolies. When the first tea ships arrived in American ports in late 1773, they encountered carefully orchestrated resistance that had been planned for months in advance. In New York and Philadelphia, popular pressure convinced tea consignees to resign their commissions, and the ships were forced to return to Britain with their cargoes intact. In Charleston, the tea was unloaded but stored in government warehouses, where it remained until the Revolution began. Only in Boston did the confrontation escalate to the point of direct action against the tea itself, largely because the Massachusetts consignees, including two sons of Governor Hutchinson, refused to resign and were protected by British naval forces in the harbor. The Boston Tea Party of December 16, 1773, represented the culmination of a decade of resistance to British taxation and the beginning of a new phase of revolutionary activity that would lead directly to armed conflict. The decision to destroy the tea rather than simply preventing its landing reflected the frustration of colonial leaders with the ineffectiveness of petitions, boycotts, and other forms of legal protest. Samuel Adams and his associates had concluded that only dramatic action would convince British authorities that American opposition to parliamentary taxation was serious and permanent. The Tea Party was planned as a carefully controlled demonstration that would make a clear political statement, while avoiding unnecessary violence or destruction of property beyond the tea itself. The carefully planned nature of the Tea Party demonstrated the organizational sophistication of the resistance movement and its ability to mobilize popular support for radical action. The men who participated in the destruction of the tea were not a spontaneous mob, but a disciplined group of artisans, merchants, and laborers who had been selected for their reliability and commitment to the cause. Their disguise as Mohawk Indians was both a practical measure to avoid identification and a symbolic statement that they were rejecting their identity as British subjects. The discipline displayed during the Tea Party, with participants carefully sweeping the decks clean and replacing a broken padlock, showed that this was a political demonstration rather than a riot. The economic impact of the Tea Party was significant, with the destroyed tea valued at approximately £10,000, equivalent to more than $1 million in modern currency. But the political and psychological impact was far greater. as the event demonstrated that colonial resistance had moved beyond legal protest to direct action against British property. The Tea Party also revealed the extent to which colonial leaders were willing to risk escalation of their conflict with Britain in order to maintain their principles. They understood that destroying the tea would provoke severe retaliation from the British government, but they believed that compromise on the taxation issue would ultimately lead to the complete loss of colonial liberty. The British response to the Boston Tea Party would prove to be one of the most fateful decisions in the history of the British Empire. Rather than seeking to understand the causes of colonial resistance or attempting to address colonial grievances through negotiation and compromise, the North administration chose to respond with punitive measures designed to isolate Massachusetts and demonstrate the consequences of defying parliamentary authority. The Coercive Acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts, would unite the colonies in opposition to British rule and make reconciliation virtually impossible. British officials believed that a firm response would deter further resistance and demonstrate that the empire could not be challenged with impunity. The Boston Port Act, the first of the Coercive Acts, closed the port of Boston to all commercial traffic until the destroyed tea was paid for and order was restored to the satisfaction of British authorities. This measure struck directly at the economic foundation of Massachusetts' largest city and threatened to reduce Boston from a thriving commercial center to an impoverished backwater. The act also established a dangerous precedent by punishing an entire community for the actions of a few individuals, violating traditional British concepts of justice and proportionality. The closure of the port affected not only Boston merchants but also workers, sailors, and artisans whose livelihoods depended on maritime commerce. The Massachusetts Government Act fundamentally altered the colony's charter by giving the royal governor the power to appoint members of the upper house of the legislature and local officials who had previously been elected by the people. The act also restricted town meetings to once per year, unless specifically authorized by the governor, striking at the heart of New England's tradition of local self-government. These changes transformed Massachusetts from a largely self-governing colony into a royal dependency subject to direct imperial control. The act represented a fundamental assault on the principle of representative government and suggested that Parliament could unilaterally alter colonial charters whenever it chose. The Administration of Justice Act, dubbed the Murder Act by colonial critics, provided that British officials accused of crimes in Massachusetts could be tried in Britain or in other colonies if the governor believed they could not receive fair trials in Massachusetts. This measure seemed to place British officials above colonial law and suggested that British authorities had no confidence in colonial justice, despite the fair trials given to the soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre. Colonial leaders argued that the act would encourage British officials to commit crimes against colonists, knowing that they could escape local justice by claiming they could not receive fair trials. The Quartering Act, while not specifically aimed at Massachusetts, required all colonies to provide housing and supplies for British troops, even in private homes if necessary public accommodations were not available. This act revived colonial fears about standing armies and forced civilians to support military forces that many viewed as armies of occupation rather than protection. The prospect of soldiers quartered in private homes seemed to violate the fundamental principle that a man's home was his castle and raised fears about the security of colonial families and property. The Quebec Act, while not technically one of the Coercive Acts, was passed at the same time and was viewed by many colonists as part of the same punitive policy. The act extended Quebec's boundaries south to the Ohio River, cutting off the western land claims of several colonies, and established Catholicism as the official religion of Quebec while providing for French civil law rather than English common law. Protestant colonists viewed these provisions as threats to their religious liberty and legal traditions. The act also seemed to reward French Catholics who had been enemies during the recent war while punishing English colonists who had been loyal to the crown. The passage of the Intolerable Acts marked a fundamental shift in the nature of the conflict between Britain and her American colonies. Previous disputes had focused on specific policies like the Stamp Act or Townshend Acts that could be repealed or modified without acknowledging fundamental changes in the imperial relationship. The Intolerable Acts, however, challenged the basic structure of colonial government and society, making compromise much more difficult and forcing colonists to choose between submission and resistance. The acts also demonstrated that the British government was willing to use its power to punish entire communities for political opposition, raising fears about what other punitive measures might follow. The colonial response to the Intolerable Acts demonstrated the extent to which a decade of resistance had created networks of communication and cooperation that transcended individual colony boundaries. Within weeks of the Act's passage, committees of correspondence throughout America were coordinating relief efforts for Boston and planning unified resistance to what they viewed as a threat to the liberty of all Americans. The Virginia House of Burgesses called for a day of fasting and prayer to protest the closing of Boston Harbor, while other colonies organized boycotts of British goods and began collecting supplies for the besieged city. This coordinated response showed that colonial resistance had evolved from isolated protests in individual colonies to a continental movement. The decision to convene a Continental Congress represented a revolutionary step in the development of American political institutions and the assertion of colonial rights. The Congress, which met in Philadelphia beginning in September 1774, brought together delegates from 12 colonies to coordinate resistance to British policies and to petition for redress of grievances. The very act of meeting as a continental body implied a level of political unity that had never before existed in British America and suggested that the colonies might be capable of acting as a single political entity. The selection of delegates and their instructions from colonial assemblies showed that the Congress had broad popular support and legitimate authority to speak for American interests. The First Continental Congress faced the difficult task of balancing the demands of radical delegates who favored immediate resistance with the concerns of moderate delegates who hoped to avoid a complete break with Britain. The Congress ultimately adopted a middle course that satisfied neither extreme, but reflected the complex mixture of loyalty and resistance that characterized colonial attitudes in 1774. The Continental Association, which organized a comprehensive boycott of British goods, represented a compromise between those who wanted immediate military action and those who preferred to rely entirely on petitions and legal protests. The association also established a timeline for escalating resistance if British policies were not changed. The association went beyond previous boycott efforts by creating enforcement mechanisms that reached into every community in America and established revolutionary institutions that would eventually replace British authority. Local committees were empowered to identify violators of the boycott, publish their names in newspapers, and subject them to social and economic ostracism. These committees quickly evolved into shadow governments that exercised many of the functions of regular civil authority while maintaining their revolutionary character. They collected taxes, organized militia companies, and made decisions about local affairs that had previously been handled by colonial governments. The success of the association demonstrated the extent to which colonial society had been transformed by a decade of resistance to British policies. The committees that enforced the boycott drew their membership from artisans, small merchants, and farmers who had previously been excluded from political leadership, but who now found themselves wielding significant power over their communities. This democratization of political authority would have profound implications for the development of American society during and after the Revolution. It also showed that ordinary colonists were willing to make significant economic sacrifices to support the resistance movement, even when those sacrifices affected their daily lives and livelihoods. The association also revealed the growing influence of ideas about natural rights and popular sovereignty that would eventually justify the complete rejection of British authority. The committees justified their actions not by appeal to British law or colonial charters, but by claiming to represent the will of the people and to defend rights that belong to all human beings regardless of their political status. This ideological transformation was as important as the practical organization of resistance in preparing the way for independence. Colonial leaders were beginning to think of themselves not as British subjects, seeking to protect traditional rights, but as free people defending universal principles of human liberty. By the spring of 1775, the escalating cycle of resistance and repression had created a situation in which armed conflict seemed increasingly inevitable. General Thomas Gage, who served as both military commander and royal governor of Massachusetts, found himself governing a province in which British authority existed only where it could be enforced by military power. The provincial government had effectively ceased to function, replaced by a network of revolutionary committees and a provincial congress that exercised many of the powers of a sovereign government. Gage controlled Boston and a few other fortified positions, but the countryside was largely in the hands of colonial militia companies that had been organizing and training for months. The decision to seize colonial military supplies at Lexington and Concord reflected British recognition that the situation in Massachusetts had moved beyond the possibility of peaceful resolution. Gage had received orders from London to arrest the leaders of the resistance movement and to prevent the accumulation of military supplies that could be used against British forces. The march to Concord on April 19, 1775, was intended as a decisive blow that would decapitate the resistance movement and demonstrate British determination to maintain imperial authority. Gage hoped that quick action would prevent the spread of rebellion to other colonies and restore British control over Massachusetts. The battles of Lexington and Concord, however, revealed the extent to which colonial society had been militarized during the previous months of crisis. The Minutemen who confronted British troops on Lexington Green and at Concord Bridge were not untrained farmers, but members of organized military companies that had been drilling and preparing for armed conflict for months. Their ability to mobilize rapidly and to inflict significant casualties on professional British troops demonstrated that colonial resistance had evolved from political protest to military rebellion. The fighting also showed that colonists were willing to risk their lives in armed confrontation with British forces, crossing a line that made reconciliation much more difficult. The news of Lexington and Concord spread rapidly throughout the colonies, carried by an efficient network of express riders and committees of correspondence that had been established during the previous decade of resistance. Within days, militia companies throughout New England were marching toward Boston, while assemblies and conventions in other colonies began organizing their own military forces and declaring their support for Massachusetts. The speed and coordination of this response revealed the extent to which the colonies had developed the institutional capacity for unified military action. It also demonstrated that the conflict had moved beyond a local dispute between Massachusetts and the British government to become a continental crisis. The siege of Boston that followed the battles of Lexington and Concord marked the beginning of a new phase of the conflict in which military action would increasingly dominate political considerations. The Continental Congress, reconvening in May 1775, found itself faced with the need to coordinate a war effort, while still officially seeking reconciliation with Britain. The appointment of George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army represented both a practical military decision and a symbolic statement that the conflict had become truly continental in scope. Washington's appointment also reflected the Congress's understanding that successful military leadership would require not only tactical skill, but also the political ability to hold together a diverse coalition of colonial forces. Washington's appointment was politically significant because it demonstrated the colony's commitment to unified action under Virginia leadership, helping to ensure that the conflict would not remain confined to New England. His military experience, personal character, and social standing made him an ideal choice to command forces drawn from different colonies with varying military traditions and political cultures. Perhaps most importantly, his willingness to serve without pay symbolized the Republican ideals that were beginning to shape colonial resistance to British authority. Washington understood that he was not simply a military commander, but a symbol of American virtue and commitment to the cause of liberty. The Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775 further demonstrated that colonial forces could inflict serious casualties on professional British troops, even in a conventional military engagement. Although the British technically won the battle, by forcing the colonists to abandon their positions. The heavy losses they suffered convinced many observers that the war would be longer and more costly than initially anticipated. The battle also revealed the determination of ordinary colonists to risk their lives in defense of what they viewed as their fundamental rights and liberties. The courage displayed by colonial forces at Bunker Hill helped to build confidence that American troops could stand against the best soldiers in the world. The Olive Branch Petition, adopted by the Continental Congress in July 1775, represented a final attempt to avoid a complete break with Britain while maintaining colonial rights and interests. The petition appealed directly to King George III, bypassing Parliament and expressing hope that royal intervention could resolve the crisis and restore harmony within the empire. The moderate tone of the petition reflected the continued influence of delegates who hoped that reconciliation might still be possible if both sides showed flexibility and goodwill. The petition also served a political purpose by demonstrating to moderate colonists and foreign observers that Americans had exhausted peaceful remedies before resorting to armed resistance. The rejection of the Olive Branch Petition by the British government and the King's proclamation declaring the colonies to be in rebellion marked the end of serious efforts at reconciliation and set the stage for the final break between Britain and her American colonies. The King's refusal even to receive the petition demonstrated that British authorities viewed the conflict as a simple matter of law enforcement, rather than a legitimate political dispute that might be resolved through negotiation and compromise. The Royal Proclamation also authorized military action against the colonies and encouraged foreign powers to treat American vessels as pirates, effectively declaring war on the American colonies. The publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in January 1776 provided the intellectual framework that many colonists needed to justify the complete rejection of British authority and the establishment of independent American governments. Paine's pamphlet attacked not only the specific policies of the British government, but the entire system of monarchy and hereditary privilege that underlay British society. His argument that independence was both necessary and inevitable helped to transform colonial resistance from a conservative defense of traditional rights into a revolutionary movement for political and social transformation. Paine's writing style was deliberately plain and accessible, making complex political arguments understandable to ordinary readers who might have been intimidated by more scholarly treatments. The impact of Common Sense was immediate and profound, with more than 100,000 copies sold within 3 months of publication, and the pamphlet's arguments discussed in taverns, churches, and homes throughout America. Paine's plain-speaking style and his use of biblical references made his radical political ideas accessible to ordinary colonists who might have been intimidated by more scholarly treatments of political theory. His argument that America had the moral obligation to serve as an asylum for liberty-made independence seemed not only practical but morally necessary. The pamphlet also provided colonists with a vision of what independent American governments might look like, helping to make the transition from resistance to revolution seem both possible and desirable. The movement toward independence gained momentum throughout the spring of 1776 as individual colonies began instructing their delegates to the Continental Congress to support a formal declaration of independence. Virginia's instructions to its delegates in May 1776 marked a crucial turning point, as the largest and most influential colony committed itself to complete separation from Britain. Other colonies quickly followed Virginia's lead, creating the political consensus necessary for the Continental Congress to act. The process of instructing delegates also provided an opportunity for colonial assemblies and conventions to debate the merits of independence and to build popular support for the final break with Britain. The appointment of a committee to draft a Declaration of Independence represented the culmination of more than a decade of constitutional argument and political resistance. Thomas Jefferson's draft drew upon the natural rights philosophy that had been developing in American political thought since the Stamp Act crisis, but it also reflected the specific grievances that had accumulated during years of conflict with British authority. The Declaration's list of charges against King George III provided a comprehensive indictment of British imperial policy and justified American independence as a necessary response to systematic tyranny. Jefferson's elegant prose transformed a political document into a statement of universal principles that would inspire democratic movements for generations. The adoption of the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776, marked the formal beginning of the United States as an independent nation. But it also represented the logical culmination of a process that had been underway since the end of the 7 Years' War. The constitutional arguments that colonists had developed to oppose British taxation, the institutional networks they had created to coordinate resistance, and the military forces they had organized to defend their communities all contributed to their ability to make the transition from resistance to revolution to independence. The Declaration also transformed the nature of the conflict from a civil war within the British Empire to a war between independent nations, opening the possibility of foreign alliances and international recognition. The Declaration's assertion that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed represented a revolutionary challenge to the entire system of European monarchy and aristocracy. By basing American independence on universal principles of human rights rather than on the specific grievances of British subjects, the Declaration transformed a colonial rebellion into a broader struggle for human liberty that would inspire democratic movements throughout the world. The document's influence extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of the American Revolution, providing a philosophical foundation for democratic government that continues to shape political thought and practice today. The path from the Boston Tea Party to the Declaration of Independence revealed both the inevitability and the contingency of American independence. The escalating cycle of resistance and repression that characterized the period from 1773 to 1776 made some form of armed conflict increasingly likely, but the specific decisions made by leaders on both sides of the Atlantic determined whether that conflict would result in reconciliation or independence. The British decision to respond to colonial resistance with punitive measures rather than genuine reform made compromise increasingly difficult, while the colonial decision to move beyond legal protest to organized resistance and finally to armed rebellion reflected their growing conviction that their rights and liberties could not be preserved within the British Empire. The transformation of colonial resistance into American independence also reflected the broader social and economic changes that had been reshaping American society throughout the 18th century. The growth of colonial population, the expansion of commerce and manufacturing, and the development of distinctly American cultural and political institutions all contributed to the colonists' sense that they had outgrown their subordinate status within the British Empire. The Revolution thus represented not only a political break with Britain, but also the recognition of an American identity that had been developing for generations. This American identity was shaped by the experience of building communities in a new world, governing themselves through representative institutions, and defending their interests against distant authorities who often seemed to misunderstand colonial conditions and needs. The success of the independence movement ultimately depended on the ability of colonial leaders to mobilize broad popular support for resistance to British authority while maintaining enough unity among the diverse colonial populations to sustain a prolonged military and political struggle. The institutional networks created during the resistance period, from committees of correspondence to continental congresses to continental armies, provided the foundation for the new American governments that would emerge from the Revolution. The ideas about natural rights, popular sovereignty, and limited government that justified colonial resistance to British authority would also shape the development of American political institutions and continue to influence American political thought for generations to come. The Revolution thus established not only American independence, but also the principles and institutions that would guide the new nation's development as a democratic republic.